All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're looking at something that's, well, it's pretty unsettling, but also fascinating. Think about this. Our society has two figures who are essentially systematic killers. You've got the soldier, who we often call a hero, and then you've got the serial killer, who we see as a monster. One gets medals, the other gets a life sentence. But at the end of the day, both are taking human lives. So what's the real difference? What truly separates them? Let's get right into it.
So, yeah, that's the big question we're going to try to answer today. And look, this isn't just for shock value. This is about really digging into the complex, maybe even uncomfortable, lines that we as a society draw around violence. What makes one act of killing okay and another one not? The answer, as you'll see, tells us a whole lot about them, but it probably tells us even more about ourselves.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the rules of the game, which is kind of a wild concept for both. Then we'll compare the soldier and the serial killer side by side. After that, we'll get into the really big one, motive. Then, what happens when those rules get broken? And finally, we'll tie it all together to figure out where we draw that line.
All right, first up, the rules of engagement. It sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? Making rules for something as brutal and chaotic as killing, but believe it or not, humanity has been trying to do exactly that for a very, very long time, at least when it comes to war.
And this is not some new idea. I mean, we're talking thousands of years. You can go all the way back to 1750 BC, to the Code of Hammurabi, which literally said the strong shouldn't oppress the weak. Then you jump forward to the 7th century, where Caliph Abu Bakr laid out rules to protect women, children, and even nature on the battlefield. And of course, you get to the more modern stuff we've all heard of, like the Geneva and Hague Conventions. It's this long, unbroken chain of trying to put some kind of limit, some kind of order on the chaos of war.
So all of this history gets formalized into this legal concept called jus in bello. It's Latin, and it basically means right in war. Now this is super important. It's not about whether going to war was the right call in the first place. That's a whole other can of worms. This is all about the rules you have to follow after the fighting has already begun. Think of it like there are rules for starting a boxing match, but jus in bello is about not hitting below the belt once the bell has rung.
Okay, and this is where things get really, really interesting, and honestly, a little creepy. When you put the systems side by side, you see these weird parallels. On the left, you have the official, external laws of war. On the right, you've got the serial killer's internal twisted rules. So, the law of war says you have to distinguish between soldiers and civilians. Well, a serial killer often has a victim type. They select people with similar traits. The military needs to prove proportionality and necessity for an attack. The killer has their MO, their modus operandi, which is just their consistent method. And then there's the signature, which is that extra ritualistic thing they do. It's not needed to commit the crime, but it feeds some deep psychological need. It's like a code of law versus a code of pure compulsion.
So, we've talked about their rule books. Now let's talk about the people themselves. Who are they? How do we, as a society, actually define them?
And man, when you look at it this way, they're just polar opposites. A soldier's whole identity is public. They wear a uniform so you know who they are. They're part of a clear chain of command. They carry their weapons openly. They are accountable, at least in theory, to a whole system of laws. The serial killer? It's the complete reverse. Their power is in being invisible, in blending in. They act alone, driven by their own private fantasies. They hide their weapons. They exist totally outside the law, like a ghost in the system.
And that right there is what's so terrifying. The FBI points out that these murderers often seem totally normal. They have jobs, families, they're your neighbors. While a soldier is a very clear, identifiable part of a conflict, a serial killer's greatest weapon is that they look just like everybody else. They're a hidden danger, not an open one.
Okay, this brings us to what is maybe the most important question of all. Why? What is the motive behind the killing? Because this right here is where these two worlds just completely split apart.
For a soldier, at least in a lawful war, the act of killing isn't the point. It's a tool. It's a means to an end. That end is something much bigger and totally external. It's a political goal set by a government. Things like winning a battle, taking a hill, or forcing the other side to the negotiating table. The purpose is completely outside of the individual.
And this idea that war should serve some higher purpose is ancient. Just look at that quote from the Code of Hammurabi again, from nearly 4,000 years ago. The whole point of the laws was to make sure the strong do not oppress the weak. It's about framing the violence, trying to give it a collective, societal purpose beyond just chaos and destruction.
Now flip that completely on its head for the serial killer. Their motivation is the exact opposite. It's 100% internal. There's no political goal, there's no higher purpose. For them, the killing is the goal. It's the whole point. It's all about satisfying some dark, personal, psychological craving.
And that internal drive can look a few different ways. Experts have kind of broken it down into 4 main types. You've got your hedonistic killers. They do it for the thrill, for the pleasure of it. Then you have the power/control types who get off on dominating their victims. You also have mission-oriented killers who have this twisted idea that they're ridding the world of bad people. And finally, the visionaries, who might be hearing voices or having hallucinations. But you see the common thread, right? No matter the category, it all comes from a place of deep, personal pathology.
And really, nothing drives this home more than hearing it from a killer themselves. Jeffrey Dahmer said it plain as day. The killing was just a means to an end, control and lust. He talks about it like this thing that just took over his life. That is the voice of a deep personal sickness. It's not the voice of a soldier following orders.
Okay, so what happens when someone crosses the line? When a soldier breaks the laws of war, or when a killer, well, breaks the laws of society? Let's take a look at how justice is supposed to work in both cases.
So we've basically created 2 separate court systems for what we consider illegal killing. If a soldier commits a war crime, it's a huge deal. The justice system is international. Think of things like the Nuremberg trials. Entire nations can be involved. It's a global stage. But for a serial killer, justice is local. It's handled by city police, by the FBI, by the domestic court system. The scales are totally different, international versus national, but the core idea is exactly the same, holding people responsible when they kill outside the lines we've drawn. And here's a pretty wild piece of history on that. The hunt for Jack the Ripper back in 1888, one of the most notorious serial killers ever, actually forced law enforcement to get smarter. The investigation was so massive and so baffling that it basically invented a lot of modern detective work, including the whole idea of criminal profiling. So, in a strange way, the hunt for a monster helped create the tools we still use to catch them today.
All right, let's pull all these threads together. It's time to draw that final, sharp line and answer our big question.
So what really separates them? When you boil it all down, it comes down to these 4 things. First, authority. Is it an act sanctioned by a state, or is it the act of a lone individual? Second, purpose. Is the goal a political objective, or is it for some sick psychological thrill? Third, the rules. Is the person following external, international laws, or are they driven by their own internal, twisted patterns? And finally, the action itself. Is it a public act by someone you can identify, or a secret crime by someone hiding in the shadows?
So in the end, the line between them isn't really about the physical act of killing. It's about the context that we, as a society, build around that act. It's like we have this unwritten agreement, right? We give the government the power to use violence, but only if they promise to follow a strict set of rules and do it for a public reason. A soldier is supposed to be the agent of that agreement. A serial killer is the absolute nightmare vision of that agreement being broken. And that leaves us with one last kind of heavy thought to chew on. If the only real line between a hero and a monster is a set of rules that we all made up, what does that tell you about our rules? And maybe more importantly, what does it tell you about us?